Welcome back, everybody, to God at the Movies. I am your friendly neighborhood vicar. I'm Vicar Chuck, coming to you from Colfax, Wisconsin, and we are here to do a part two of our analysis of Star Wars from a Christian slash spiritual slash religious perspective. And once again, joining me is John Evans, who is a colleague and classmate of mine at Wartburg Theological Seminary. So, John, why don't you give another quick introduction to yourself? And
Yeah, absolutely. Like Chuck said, I'm John Evans. I'm a second year Master's of Divinity student at Wartburg Theological Seminary here in Dubuque, Iowa, coming to you live from the mighty fortress that is our seminary. And Originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and glad to be here with you, Vicar Chuck. Let us continue, shall we?
yeah, and so where we left off last week or the last time, I'm not sure if this is going to come out by the week or every other week. So we're recording this. Spoiler alert: we're recording this back to back.
Mhm.
Kind of the way they filmed all three Lord of the Rings movies, but then you had to wait. Um,
Right.
but yeah, we left off with a talk of Han Solo and Greedo, and we both agreed that Han shot, and that's it.
Yes.
There was no
Yes.
first, just Han just blew away Greedo, and
Yeah.
and I'd like to pick up right from there because I know that like sure, and I don't want to get too much into all the special editions because I want to focus on the 77 version and the experience of that. But briefly, like I mean, there were some reasons that there are corporate reasons that was changed, and there were reasons that later on, like George Lucas had decided to change it, and then studios got involved. All that kind of crazy stuff that happens in films in later times. But for me, like the fact that he just blows away this bounty hunter, like that's part of his story,
Yes.
and that's part of his redemption, or not really so much a redemption. That's part of his character arc, his growth from it's all about me to there's something bigger that I'm going to be a part of, and that he chooses at the end of the first film. Even that's that big scene at the end where he comes in and he's like, "Woo!"
Yep.
He's like,
Yep.
and so that's part of his. Like, if he doesn't start in that place of it's all about me and to heck with everybody else, like his arc doesn't quite have the same impact. And so
Absolutely.
from a story's perspective, I think it's far more powerful that he just blows away this bounty hunter without even
Yeah.
really asking questions. So, what say
And
you?
well, I mean, the scripture parallels are unbelievable. I mean, for God's sake, Moses murdered someone,
Mm-hmm.
and yet God still called him. And that's part of the reason why I love the Old Testament. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but I'm of Jewish ethnicity and heritage. And so one of my big things as a Christian is to really get people to appreciate the Old Testament and to understand it for what it is and to not be antinomian. Um, for those of us who are theological nerds, but
It's a
um,
seminary term, but we get
yeah,
it. So,
yes. But the Old Testament is filled with scum and villainy that God continuously says, you know what, I'm going to use that person. And each time it happens, they go, why me? And God tells them, because I called you. Enough said.
mm-hmm.
And of course, you see that also in the New Testament with
Mm-hmm.
someone like Paul, who was a
Yeah.
persecutor of the church, who had an incredible kind of, as we say, Damascus Road experience. But you see it with Peter too, someone who, denied his master and his teacher 3 times and was able to come out of that a different person. Um, and that's theology of the cross 101, how God continuously moves and works through the most unlikely ways and people to demonstrate how much God loves us. God doesn't use the powerful and the mighty.
Mm-hmm.
God calls on the weak, the scum, the villainy, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah. I have in recent years, I have come to see Han is kind of a Peter figure, because for me, Peter always comes, and this is my reading of Peter, but Peter always comes off as a little bit um, focused
Hockey.
on what he wants,
Hmm.
and what he wants is what he's going to get. And like he feels like because he's close to Jesus, he feels like he's a little bit better than the other disciples. And so he feels like he can tell Jesus, later in the ministry that, like, oh, you're not going to do that. You're not going to die. You're not going to do this. And Jesus
Hmm.
rebukes him, and then Peter does deny him, 3 times, and
Hmm.
Han denies Luke in a sense. He
Yes, he
denies
does.
to fight for the good cause. It's like, nope, I'm going to go take care of myself. The heck
Yeah.
with
Well,
this. And that's quite exactly what Peter does when the woman comes up to him and says, they're in the courtyard and there's the fire burning, and
yeah.
Jesus is being interrogated, and this woman comes up to him and says, your accent gives away that you're from Galilee. Like, we
Hmm.
know you must be with Jesus. And then he says, I swear I've never seen that
Never
man
seen.
before. And that's when the cock crows for the third
Rose.
time.
Yeah.
And then he weeps. And so that, to me, that's kind of like the arc that similar that Han has. Obviously, they're not one to one; they're not allegories, but there's lots of applicability. As I keep using that word, but um, that's what it is. It's like you can see these themes, and
Yes.
it's not, you don't see them just in Peter. You see them in other figures throughout the Bible, throughout Scripture. But for me, Peter is the one that kind of like
Hmm.
encapsulates who Han is, or Han encapsulates Peter. I'm not sure, and how much of that is deliberate, I don't know, but it does happen, and it is there. So
And
thoughts, yeah,
the fact that you use the word applicability is so important because that's part of what makes Star Wars so powerful, is that each person can come to it with their own experiences, their own imaginations, their own faith, their own, belief system or value system, and they can see it in Star Wars.
mm-hmm.
And J.R.R. Tolkien talked about the term applicability. He got so ticked off with people who would try to take specific things in Lord of the Rings and say, oh, that's an allegory for this, and that's an allegory for this. No, Tolkien said this is applicability. This is the nature of the one true myth, that we all find ourselves in the greater story of things. And it's so important that you named that, Chuck, seriously,
Yeah.
because we can get so caught up in our interpretation of it as the only interpretation. No, that's the beauty of myth, right?
Well, right, and that's what I mean for Star Wars. I think that's one of the big reasons it is so popular, is that everybody can bring their own view, their own experiences to it, and their own, like, you could, like, we're Christians, we're Lutherans, we're looking at this from a Christian perspective, but also through another lens of like the Lutheran tradition. Uh, but you can be any kind of a Christian, you can be a Buddhist, and of course, heavy Buddhist, like,
Oh yeah,
applicability in Star Wars. You could be a Hindu, you can
you
be
be
Jewish,
Jewish.
you could
Yes,
be
absolutely.
Muslim,
Yeah,
you could be a non-religious person entirely. And I know plenty of non-religious people who love Star Wars.
Star Wars.
And
Absolutely.
it's not that they don't understand the meanings, it's that they're bringing their own meaning to it. And
Yes.
that's why something like Star Wars, when it came out, as we talked about in the first episode, was like, people were like, this is going to be terrible. And it just exploded, and people were lined up around the blocks to
Yep.
see this movie again and
And
again.
again, and
It's like the first movie in history where people would like repeatedly go and view it over and over and
yeah,
over.
I
And
mean, you'd seen a little bit of that with Jaws and a little bit of that
yes,
with The Exorcist, but you had not seen it like this with Star Wars. There was actually a story of a single mom and her son in California. They went to see it, I think, a total of 30 times.
wow,
And and she said that that was what helped her and her son get through the divorce that she had just had to go through.
Hmm.
And how Star Wars, I think the exact words she used, Star Wars was a healing balm for us
Hmm.
in a time and a place that we needed it. And Lord knows it's been that for so many of us in places where we have needed hope.
Hmm.
And speaking of that, getting back to the story, right after we have the clear intention that we're going to go on this mission to save the princess and help the rebellion, we see the ultimate manifestation of how far evil is willing to go to prove its power and its point. And we see this with the Death Star, which is, you can find all kind of parallels for what the Death Star is. Is it nuclear energy? Is it warfare itself? But the interesting thing about the Death Star, in the way that the production designed it, is that on the outside, it looks, completely solid and impenetrable. But the moment you go inside of it, you see that it's hollow.
Hmm.
Like the way that it's constructed, there's all these, huge chasms and gaps and walk gangways and walkways that require bars, otherwise you're going to fall off. And it's hollow. It's this ultimate manifestation of what I would call um, the deadly arrogance of science and technology. Now, I say that with caution, because do I believe that science and technology can do great good? Yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
But if there's one thing that history has taught us, it's that, to quote Jeff Goldblum, sometimes people are so concerned with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think about whether or not they should. And
Yeah.
we have seen this time and time again throughout history where human beings have said, technology and science will save us. We have reached the new epoch. And then World War I happens. And all that same technology that was supposed to take us in the next age was used to tear human beings apart limb for limb. And Princess Leia, her reaction to seeing the Death Star blow up her home planet of Alderaan, the way the editing is done is so brilliant because we don't actually see like the aftermath of her reaction. We see the fear in her face, we see her biting her teeth. And what that allows us to do as the audience is we are her reaction. We are that, oh my God, this empire committed genocide. This
Hmm.
empire destroyed an entire world of human of beings. We don't know if everyone was human on
Right.
Alderaan, but it speaks to the how far evil will go to manifest itself. And it's something that, especially in today's age, in the time that we live in, that we must be very, very aware of. Because evil has a way of sneaking up and causing massive damage before it's too late.
Hmm. Hmm. And that brings me to, um, as you were talking about the Death Star, and the scene with Alderaan, is that there's an early scene when uh, Darth Vader. So the council in the Empire, they're sitting around that big conference table, right?
Yep,
And Darth
yep.
Vader comes in, and this kind of ties in with Han somewhat as well, because Darth Vader is like, you can tell, he's powerful. He has these powers, and one of the council people says something to the effect of like, "Oh, you're ancient religion. We don't,
We
you're
don't need you
we don't
anymore.
yeah, we don't need you anymore," because they have confidence in the Death Star. In
Yeah, he literally said, that same guy literally says, this station is now the ultimate power in the universe. I suggest we use it.
Yes, yeah. Yeah,
right?
I'm so glad you have this memory, this steel trap memory. It's awesome.
I'm a nerd. Can you tell?
Right. No, that's great. So am I, but you just have a
Yeah,
better memory of all these things. This is awesome.
yeah.
But and then Vader like, turns and like does this force choke,
I find
and
lack of faith disturbing.
yeah, I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Yeah,
And Vader clearly has faith in like the wrong thing or a
yeah,
twisted faith because the force is
yes,
the force, but his faith is like, I think we could say, or at least I would say that his faith is twisted and
yeah.
been
It's
warped.
yeah. It's almost like the parallel between like the beauty of creation and how easily sin can't create. Sin can only take and destroy and malform. And Darth Vader is like the ultimate manifestation of that. Someone who was once good and whole, but became so twisted and malformed and destroyed that he's barely alive, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a line when like it's somewhere in the film, I can't remember exactly, but Obi-Wan says something like, well, he's mostly machine now,
Yeah.
because you know, in Star Wars, in this 1977 version of Star Wars, like it's explicitly stated, or at least very strongly implied, that Vader slowly becomes Vader over time. It's not
Yes.
a once, it just happens overnight, as it then ends up doing in like the prequel trilogy. But like he slowly becomes this twisted uh machine that, like, he's technology, and this plays into your idea of technology, how it's great, but it can be abused and misused. And that's kind of like I've always seen Vader in that light, is that like he's this amalgamation of twisted faith and misuse and abuse of technology, kind of combined into this ultimate thing. I mean, he's, mostly machine, but he was once a man, and
Yeah.
you're not quite sure what he is anymore, like, because we don't, in the first film, you don't know. You just hear what Obi-Wan says, and that's kind of it.
Yeah.
And there's this whole mystery to him, but you clearly see he's powerful.
Yeah.
And and that, the idea of faith then ties in with Obi-Wan, because as they're journeying to rescue Princess Leia, Luke is doing the famous sparring scene with the little drone, with the
Mhm.
lightsaber, and Han says, I've been to one side of this galaxy to the
Yes.
other, and I've never seen anything that convinced me of one all-powerful force uniting us all together. And so
And then
he's a non-believer.
and what's funny about that scene too is right after he says that, Obi-Wan gets this like big grin on his face of,
Yeah.
you're not fooling anyone, big boy. I know what you're doing.
Yeah, but he's at least Han in this is at least stating non-belief. And
Yes. Yeah.
and does he not believe? I don't know. Like, he seems pretty, to me, I always interpret as like he just really doesn't, you know ancient religions and hokey weapons,
Weapons.
don't are no replacement for a good blaster. you know
Yeah.
um
Ancient moral codes are no match for trickle down economics. Yes, I just went there.
yeah. But I mean, that's what's so interesting about it, is there's this whole idea of, well, what is faith, and how does it, and of course it's, what do you have faith in, and who is the faith in? And like, in the original cut of Star Wars, like, I maybe you correct me, um I don't believe there's any mention of an emperor at all.
There is one mention,
Okay.
and it's in that same council room where there's some of the officers are arguing about the ramifications about, well, what is the Senate going to do because we just attacked this frigate, and then Grand Moff Tarkin comes in and says the Senate will no longer be of any concern. The Emperor has just dissolved the council.
Dissolve the council, that's right, yeah.
And so even then we get this sense of there's there is an insidious evil going on here, then that's more than just technocrats and
Yeah.
the military and vain, ambitious, dare I say it, white men,
Yeah.
because that's also got some interesting imagery. But yeah, and so this all culminates with the rescue of Princess Leia, who is she's in distress, but she is not the conventional damsel in distress. And I can't even
Right.
imagine what it must have been like to be a little girl in 1977, or even a teenager or young adult woman, to see this character who was no holds bar and didn't take crap from anybody, and that took charge of the situation and was fearless. um we had seen heroes somewhat like that, but never this explicit, where she was clearly, one of the top people in the rebellion, where, even Han, who you could say at first anyway has some slightly misogynistic tendencies,
Hmm.
is kind of like, okay, I see who's in charge.
Well, and it's
Right.
interesting because all it takes, like, I mean, because it flips the expectation on its head, like with Princess Leia, because you
Mhm.
see her like she's strong, like and even in the beginning when Vader like captures her, like she's strong, you see it,
Oh yeah.
but she still at that point still has this, like you can kind of think of her as like, oh, a more traditional damsel in distress from Buck
Hmm.
Rogers and all the old comics and old serials from back in the day. But then as soon as they break her out of that cell, like she's like taking charge, like
Yeah, she's like, give me that thing.
walking,
Wow.
get out of my way. And
Yeah.
like I'm
Yeah.
who's like just some rescue that you guys have done, like who's rescuing
You
you?
came in that thing, you're braver than I thought.
Yeah.
And can we just talk about how the Millennium Falcon is basically nothing more than like a junky old 1957 Chevrolet
Right.
that's just barely kept going?
That's right.
Yeah. So, but yeah, and we see and the parallels for that are in scripture of women who took charge and dared to be involved in leadership. We know about like Priscilla and Aquila, whom Paul worked closely with, and Chloe, who despite horrible theological interpretations were leaders in the early church. We have judges like Deborah, who were fearless in their leadership in a time and place when the people of Israel were without a government, more or less, right? Um, and we see it in Mary too. I would say a fearlessness, a courage, um, because it's impossible to read the Magnificat and not see that she had some chutzpah about her, that
Right.
she knew that soon the tables would quite literally be flipped.
Right. Right. Or Esther, who like
Yes,
literally stands up to empire.
literally is like
You
the
know?
only thing that stops um, the Jewish people from being introduced to a much earlier version of the Holocaust. Honestly.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah, and speaking of empire, like it's also like it's interesting that like the big baddie, I mean, or at least how it's framed, is that it's empire, the empire.
the
Of course,
Empire,
Jesus lived in the Roman Empire,
Empire,
and empires throughout the Bible generally are the villains. Like
yes,
they're generally not like, like I mean Egypt and Babylon. Like these are not like we don't
Syria,
yeah,
yeah,
right. Like
mhm,
they're not cast in the best light. And so because what is it about empire? What is it about empire and that word and that idea of not just a collection of people coming together and forming a government that can help stabilize society, it's not for the benefit, as Lutherans, we would say government like plays the role of caring for our neighbors. Like that's what God intends governments to do.
Yes.
Empire does not have that intention.
Right.
Empire is about domination
Yep.
and oppression and rule
Yep.
and law and order. And if you don't follow the law, then you get punished,
Yes.
which is the opposite of Lutheran theology.
Yes. And
um,
what you're also speaking to is the difference between faith and ideology. And I say this as a critique of, some things that are even going on in Christianity and our denomination right now about the danger of ideology, because ideology says you're gonna do what I tell you to, or else I'm gonna shove it down your throat. And that's both on the right and the left of
mhm,
perspective.
mhm,
Faith says, come and see.
yeah.
And that's such an important thing to remember, is that we have to make sure that as Christians that we are following the way, that we are not enforcing the way onto others, no matter what it is, whether it is our faith, our political ideals. But in the midst of standing up for justice, we must not do the very same thing that we say that we rage against, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and that's what empire does. Empire
Yes.
crushes, and empire says this is the way it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And um, and it's not for the benefit of taking care of one's neighbor. It's
No.
for the acquisition of more power,
Yes.
which is what we see in that conference room with when they're talking about the Death
Mm-hmm.
Star. It's what
Oh
we
yeah.
see, I mean, when Obi-Wan and finally confronts Vader,
Yeah.
when they're escaping the Death Star, and Obi-Wan, stands there in front of Darth Vader, and they're having that standoff before the fight. And like Vader says that, finally the student will, how does he say this?
When I last met you, I was but the learner. Now
Yes.
I am the master. And Obi-Wan replies, "You're only a master of evil."
Evil. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And people, there've been people that critique the lightsaber choreography in that scene, because they were still developing the style and all that. But to me, that lightsaber battle is not about the choreography. It's about the emotional context of what is
Mhm.
going on. Obi-Wan is facing this man that he once knew. I'm not going to give too much away of the plot for those who have not seen it.
Right.
I don't know which rock you've been living under, but anyway. Um, but you see that there is something higher clearly going on here. And what's more, Vader is taunting him and saying, your powers are weak. And then Obi-Wan responds, "No, if you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine."
Hmm.
And it's impossible not for me not to see parallels with the nature of the cross there. That Christ was struck down as a criminal and a revolutionary,
Yeah.
and thusly became more powerful than we could have possibly imagined
Hmm.
in the glory of the resurrection. And that culminates when you see Luke, Han, Leia, Chewie, and the droids when they come across, and then Luke looks across and he sees Obi-Wan, and there's this wonderful little moment where Obi-Wan sees Luke, and then he turns to Vader and he
Gives
smiles.
that little smile. Yeah.
That smile, and then he surrenders, and Vader doesn't even get a chance to slice through him.
Hmm.
And it's impossible not to see the parallel with "Where, O death, is thy sting?"
Hmm.
Because in the next moment, with Luke, angrily, firing his E11 blaster at these stormtroopers, mowing them down in anger. We hear Obi-Wan's voice calling to him, "Run, Luke, run!"
Yeah.
As in, don't waste your time on revenge here. You've got something more important to do.
Mm-hmm.
And just to talk about that for a minute, the way that Obi-Wan, comes to him in voice several times through the film, after his, death. Um, you know, for me, when I see that, it's impossible not to think of, that verse that talks about the great cloud of witnesses
Yeah.
that cheers us on. And I know that we as Lutherans don't necessarily, we don't give enough respect to the saints as we should. I'm just going to say that controversially, but I do believe that the saints cheer us on, that the saints, whose life experiences very much mirrors ours in particular, cheers us on, in our trials and tribulations. And then of course that leads ultimately to, the Death Star fight, which is, an incredible piece of editing, of, drama, and of spectacle, because it's essentially like the ultimate, World War II dogfight in some ways, where you have these, little rebel snub fighters that, are like little pea shooters against this giant monolith, with, these imperial ships that are clearly, at, at least with the Y-wing, way more maneuverable. I'll go to battle for the X-wing, but give the Y-wing some love. But that whole Death Star fight scene is very interesting as well. I mean, what do you get when you take a look at the whole Death Star battle scene? Like, what is that, invoking you? I'm curious about that.
So it's interesting because there's this, like, there's this kind of long buildup before
Yeah.
that to the Death Star, when they're all kind of like they're planning it out, and they're all in the hangar, and they're all
Mm-hmm.
like there's this, you can see it. I mean, it's very, you get that feeling of, oh, good grief, they're going to do this,
Yes.
and like some of these people are probably not going to come back, which is the sense that you get.
Mm-hmm.
And of course that's when Han, like, shuffles off, and he's like, I'm out of here, man, you guys are on your own. I wish you well, but I got to go pay a gangster, and I'm not
He,
getting
he
into this.
pulled an Eric Cartman. Screw you guys. I'm getting him.
Yeah, I mean, he's taken off. And um so there's that whole sequence that builds up to that. And they're lowering the droids into the X-wings, and
Oh
R2's
yeah.
in there, and you're like, it has that sense of like seriousness, like, I mean, by then, if like you're not swept up in the movie, then you're probably going to turn it off, but if you're in, you're like in, and you're like worried about these people and what's going to happen and how are they going to do this.
Well, and the tensions being built up too, with like how the editing is done, with those very fast cuts of, the pilots running, trying to get to their ships, the crews, taking out the fuel lines. And that's the power of editing in particular right there, how editing can convey that sense of urgency, that sense of, not many of these folks, if any of them, are going to come back alive, you
Yeah,
know? Yeah.
yeah, and at that point they're going up, you know against something that we have seen, the ultimate weapon of destruction. It
Mm-hmm.
destroyed an entire planet. And how are this little tiny group of people, this little force for good, going to go up against this empire? How can they do this? How is this going to happen? And we get to that build up, and they take off, and the battle ensues. And the thing that's like really interesting to me is it comes back to like it's technology versus technology,
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
And over and over again, like they try the technology and they fail, and they try the technology again and
Technology and fails.
fail and fail and fail. And like it's like they're relying on the technology that the humans have created. So in a sense, they're relying on themselves to rescue them.
Yes.
And finally, you get and then of course Darth Vader is, he's flying, and he's
Yeah.
following Luke, and he's like, oh, this force is strong with this one,
Hmm.
and and there's that great scene when it looks like all is going to be lost because they just can't fire into that little space to hit the reactor to destroy
Hmm.
it. They can't because and Han swoops in, takes out a couple of the other fighters, makes way for Luke, and then they're like, the targeting system, the technology is going to get it this time, and then that's when the voice comes in. Obi-Wan,
Use the Force, Luke.
Force, use the Force, Luke,
Which
and
for us as Christians, it's impossible not to hear that and think of trust in the power of the Holy Spirit.
mhm.
Let go.
It's the letting go. Yeah,
Yes.
it's the
Yeah.
letting go of our own
Our
uh,
ego.
our ego, our ability to our trust in our abilities, the trust that we have in our technology, the trust that we have in our
Mhm.
skills, that we can do it. We just give me one more chance and we're going to get it. And he finally turns off the targeting system, and they're chattering like, you've turned off your targeting system, Luke, what's
Mhm.
happening? And then he just pulls that thing to the side and he closes his eyes and fires. And it's the faith
Yeah.
that destroys the evil in that moment.
And his reaction to, like, right after he sees those photon torpedoes goes in, where he just goes like, it's
Yes, that's
that
right.
thing of, it's like, oh my God, oh my God, I just took the leap of faith and it actually turned out okay, right?
Yeah.
Um, I do want to go back real quick though to the whole technology thing, because of course they had to, the Death Star plans were stolen.
Hmm.
And of course, that's more fleshed out in Rogue One,
Yeah.
which is a fantastic film in its own right, and it explains a lot of the backstory behind the events leading up to it. But the interesting thing too, also, that it speaks to is, without the plans, without technology,
Mm.
they could not have been able to destroy it. But at the same time, if they had relied entirely on the technology, if they had
Yeah.
trusted in human prowess and ability alone,
Right.
it wouldn't have worked. And to me, that speaks to the nature of the fact that faith and science go hand in hand.
Hmm.
They're both sides of the same coin. And to kind of go on a slight rant for a little bit, it to me, it's completely logical to say, what if evolution was the how and not the what? And
Right. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it speaks to that nature of, you can't, you were talking about, black and white, one or the other, right? The reality is that it's in that fuzzy gray middle
Hmm.
100% of the time. And you see that, and oh my God, and the music too, with how it cranks up in its intensity after he fires it, and the edits. And I've always wondered about something, because the first time the Death Star fires, you just hear one of the technicians say, commence primary ignition, and then they go through the cycle. But the second time, you hear a technician that keeps saying, stand by, stand by,
Mm.
stand by. And it's always made me wonder, what if this technician was having a moral quandary? What if
Mm.
what if his moral quandary allowed for what happened to happen?
Yeah.
Which, I mean, when it happens, like, my dad said that when all that was going on, people in that theater in Marietta, Georgia in 1977 were literally standing on their feet saying, go, 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 get out of there, go, go, go. And then when the Death Star blew up, they literally, he said, the entire theater just like rose up and just was cheering and screaming, and people were even crying.
Mm-hmm.
And because it was just so powerful, and it was such this beautiful metaphor for what we have to do every day in our daily lives, where we go up against the Death Stars in our lives. You know, it's oh man, I get chills even talking about it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I'd like to just kind of close on this thought is that, um, Luke doesn't do this just by himself, right?
No.
Everyone, like we talked about diversity in the cantina, but like
Mhm.
everybody's involved in this. Like
Yes.
every race, species, the droids, like everybody is
Yeah.
involved. The no good, the space pirate with the heart of gold concludes his arc in this film, and he's like finally learns to care about other people over himself. And like it's not just one person, right? Everyone is involved, and that's in that sense, that's and so much of the film, Luke is kind of like a Christ-like figure, but in this, he's like, in this moment, he's like a stand-in for us all. Like he
Yes.
learns to not just he doesn't trust in himself. He trusts in the Force or a greater power or God or the Holy Spirit, or however you want to interpret that. But also, he trusts in everyone else around him. And he even has faith in Han, who's like shuffling off, like, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
But he says, we need you.
Yep.
And turns out they did need him.
Yep. Yep.
It's Han that really saves the day. He's the one that makes it possible for Luke to fire that shot. And so, like, there's all these pieces come together. And, that's very much like our lives. And we see that so many times in the scriptures. Like, I mean, no one is an island unto themselves. I mean, everything has to come together in this certain way for things to happen. And I think in that sense, like you talked about Star Wars being like an American, uniquely American mythos. And I think there's something to that, in that e pluribus unum, out of many one.
Many one. Yep.
And
Yeah.
like there's this massive group of all these different peoples and cultures and languages, and they all come together to take on the empire, and they defeat it, and of course the one of the last scenes we just see, the Darth Vader and his little ship spiral away. Yep.
Yep.
And so there's an opening. They knew they wanted to do something else if this was going to be a success, but I mean, had it not been, it still would have been a satisfying conclusion, like but it's of course then the scene with the medals, and poor Chewie doesn't get one, and I'm not sure what's going on with that. That was but
also quick recommendation to your viewers: if you want to see something that is unbelievably uncomfortably funny, watch the metal scene without any music.
I have done that before.
It's horrible.
It's funny. It's really strange.
And like when you see like bloopers and outtakes, like you see why the actors were like cracking up, because it's like it's so awkward because there's like no dialogue or anything. But it once again, that also mirrors what I was talking about earlier with how so much of the story reflects the making of the film, how all these different people came together to make this impossible thing happen that no one believed in, and yet it changed the world forever, and it touched so many lives, right?
Yeah. And here we are 43 years later.
Yeah, 1944. It'll be 44.
44 in May, right? This May?
Yeah, last year was the 40th anniversary of Empire.
Okay.
This year will be the 40th anniversary of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Okay. Well, that's another one that is on my list to do for sure. So I'll invite you back for that. Yeah, it's definitely on my list, as well as the third Indiana Jones movie,
Ooh,
Last Crusade.
mm,
So,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah, this has been super fun. Thank you for joining us. Obviously, with any movies, like, you can't get it all. Like, there's so much to talk about, and there's so much
Yeah,
symbolism.
absolutely.
And if we do this again, which I fully intend to, we do Empire Strikes Back. There will be a
Yes.
whole lot more Christian explicit themes coming through.
Oh,
Like,
oh,
it's really deep.
much more.
You
So,
know,
and I would also argue Jewish as well, because the director Irvin Kershner he was Jewish, but he said he was a student of Christianity.
ah, yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So
So when we do that, that'll be a
oh
whole lot of
man,
fun. But this was great, and we will do Empire at some point. So it won't be too long. So we'll be doing that, and then eventually Return of the Jedi. So, but thank you for joining
awesome.
us. Thank you, John, for coming to do this. This has been amazing fun. I love doing this. I love talking about movies and television and literature, and I love just analyzing these things from a religious and Christian point of view. And if you're not a Christian, that's okay. It's the great thing about Star Wars in particular is there's all sorts of applicability that we talked about earlier. Um,
Yes.
so, so
Yep.
thank you again for joining us. And until next time, we will see you on God at the Movies.
Peace.